The first recipe we're going to be doing is a batter. You might refer to them as batter bread, but these are going to be biscuits. I'm making this out of Bisquick, and the recipe is on the side of the container. But we have 2 cups of Bisquick, we have 1/3 cup of shortening, 2/3 cups of milk, and 3 eggs. So the first thing they say to do is you want to cut the shortening in to the Bisquick. And they recommend using either a fork or a cutting device. I actually like using a cutting device. So we're going to cut this in until the pieces are about the size of peas. This is pretty much a normal thing to do. Okay, the next thing we're going to do, it says go ahead and add the milk and the eggs. Go ahead and stir it up. Now, Bisquick does not rely upon yeast to rise the biscuits. I'm pretty much sure they just use baking powder or baking soda somewhere in the ingredients. They use baking soda. We can go ahead and freeze dry this without harming the yeast because there is no yeast. One of the problems with breads and batters that contain yeast is the vacuum forces will kill the yeast if the yeast has been activated by moisture prior to freeze drying. So we're just going to mix this up and we're going to freeze dry it. I'm going to put cheddar cheese and chives in this, but we'll do this after it's reconstituted. Now, it would be simpler just to take your freeze-dried ingredients together in the future and make the batter or the dough fresh. But the problem with this recipe, because it has eggs, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So that's why we're going to freeze-dry it. So I suggest any batter or dough that contains eggs would be a good candidate to freeze-dry. So this is just a small batch, so we're just going to spread this out on the tray. We're going to go pre-freeze it and throw it in the freeze dryer. And this stuff will freeze dry pretty fast because of the low moisture content. This is not spreading as much as I thought it would. Okay, well, I'll have to work on that. Okay, so this is the biscuits, drop biscuits, and we're going to go ahead and put it in the freezer. So this is having a hard time spreading, which sometimes doughs do. So we just take a little bit of spray. You can push this down a lot easier with washed fingers. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put that in the freezer and freeze dry it. The next batter recipe we're going to be doing also contains eggs. If it wasn't for the egg issue, it would be much easier just to combine all the ingredients together and be done with it. But we have eggs and we have cooking oil, which are going to be 2 ingredients that's going to make it hard for us to make a batter beforehand without being freeze dried. We have 1 3/4 cups of flour, and then we have a tablespoon baking powder, and we have 1/2 teaspoon of salt. So we're just going to mix all the dry ingredients together here, and we're going to add the wet ingredients. So we have 2 beaten eggs, and the eggs is going to be the issue on why we're freeze drying this. Because the eggs are raw, they just don't have the shelf life that we would need. And then we have 1/2 cup of cooking oil. And did I say that this is for waffles? I can't remember if I did or didn't, but this is a really good waffle recipe that my family uses, and I like it a lot. Probably one of the best waffle recipes. Now, one of the things, when I was growing up, and you know, when I was in Boy Scouts, we lived and breathed with this brand called Krusty's. This is a great pancake. It's great for pancakes and great for waffles, and you just have to add water. And so that's one thing I guess you'll need to determine what you want to use for pancakes and waffles, because there is this one step, and I'm sure the shelf life on this is going to be pretty good. Actually, it says it's best to use by October 17th, 2021, so that was 3 or 4 months ago, and I think we bought it in the springtime. So nothing against Krusty's. I love Krusty's, but I like this recipe even better. Okay, so the eggs are in there. Now we're going to add the milk, and this is 1 3/4 cup of milk, and I'll have the recipe for this at the end of the video. And I don't know where this recipe came from. My wife is telling me that this could be a really old Betty Crocker recipe. My wife, when she was growing up, was given this Betty Crocker recipe book like back in the 70s, and it's probably the best recipe book that she ever received, and she still has it. I mean, it's like dog-eared and everything, but all the Betty Crocker books since then have not been the same like the one she received, and we still have that. Okay, so this is all done. We move all of these things out of the way. And usually when we make this, the big time when we make this is for Christmas time. We always have Christmas waffles on Christmas Day before we open all the gifts. And I will usually end up quadrupling this recipe for my family. Now, this does not have any yeast. It has baking powder that will do the rising, and so this should be a no-brainer recipe for the freeze dryer, because we won't have to worry about killing the yeast off. And I've noticed that batters and dough, because of their dryness, usually freeze dry pretty quick. Okay, so there we go. This is for waffles. I'm going to go ahead and throw it in the freezer. The next recipe is a really good breadstick and pizza dough recipe. And this recipe calls for yeast, but we're not going to add yeast to this recipe, because in all the examples I've done and all the studies I've done, once yeast becomes wet, it becomes activated, and then once it goes through the freeze drying process with the extreme temperatures, and more important, with the high vacuum, it will either damage the yeast or it kills the yeast outright. So we're going to put everything together and make the dough, and then we're going to freeze dry it. Now there's one other thing. So we're not going to put any yeast into it. And another thing you got to watch out for doughs in freeze drying is we do not want to knead the dough. We just want to mix it enough to combine all the ingredients together, because once you knead the dough and you start to develop the gluten structures will not freeze dry. They become like a polymer, they become elastic, and once they do that, they will not absorb water, and so the little gluten structures will appear like sesame seeds throughout your dough, and it doesn't really change the taste of the dough too much, but it just doesn't work out right. So no yeast, no kneading. So here we go. We're going to start off with, well, 1.5 cups of warm water. Now this is when we normally would put the yeast in here, but this is going to be yeast free for now, and then we're going to add the yeast afterwards. So we have the water, we're going to add the sugar, and of course this is when we normally would add the yeast and let it sit there for a while, but we're going to go bypass that and we're going to continue on. Now this recipe originally calls for 1 tablespoon of malt, as in like malted milk, but I don't have any malted milk. But the substitution for malt that I found is really good is going to be 1 tablespoon of molasses. The malt gives it a really nice taste. How can I explain it? It enhances the body of the bread, if that makes any sense. So we got the molasses, and then we got 1 teaspoon of salt, and we're going to mix this up. And then we have 4 cups of flour. You can use regular flour. I prefer using bread flour because this gives it a little bit more body. I'm just going to lay it in the tray. Try to get a nice uniform thickness. Okay, so we have these 2 ready for the freezer. Next, we're making bread. This is a favorite recipe of our family. It's called honey wheat bread, but instead of making it out of regular flour and wheat flour, because I don't have any wheat flour, I'm just making it out of straight flour. I'm making it out of bread flour, and I'm going to double the recipe, but I will put the recipe at the end of the video. But we're going to start with a cup of water, but like I said, I'm doubling the recipe for this, so this is actually 2 cups. We're not putting the yeast in, because the freeze drying process will damage or destroy most of the yeast. We'll put the yeast in after the fact. So we have the water, and then we have the flour, and then we have the honey. The normal recipe is for 1 tablespoon, but we're putting 2 tablespoons honey at this time. 2 eggs and 2 teaspoons of salt. Like I said, this is doubling the recipe, but I will have the regular recipe at the end of the. And then the butter. And we're going to mix all this up together. But the important thing is, we're only going to mix, we're not going to knead it. So once all the ingredients are combined, we're going to stop there, because if you continue to knead bread, the gluten structure, when it's freeze-dried, will not accept water, and your texture of your bread will have the sesame seed-like spots all over it. So we just want to combine the ingredients. Once it's done and out of the freeze dryer, we'll run it through a food processor or through a blender, turn it back into powder, add the water and yeast then, and then we'll knead it. Move this around just to blend the ingredients, and then we're going to separate this into two pieces. Like so. Into the freezer they go. The batter I'm making now is an all-purpose batter that's great for onion rings, and it's the primary batter that is used on orange chicken and lemon chicken that goes around the meat prior to deep frying. So you could say this is a deep fry batter. So we start with 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water, a half a cup of cornstarch, a half a cup of cooking oil, 1 teaspoon soda, baking soda, 1 teaspoon salt. Now this is just a basic seasoned recipe depending on what you're actually going to be using it for. For example, if you wanted to batter some fish, this would also work as a fish batter, and you could maybe put paprika in with it, so you can take this batter and season it any way you want. Now this kind of comes up as a thick batter, and you can thin it as needed. So we're going to go ahead and freeze dry this and then reconstitute it and make some onion rings. So into the freezer this goes. The dough is right out of the freeze dryer, so the next step is to run it through a food processor or a blender and put it back into powder form. That's going to be the easiest way of mixing it with water. Now we have the biscuit dough. These are the pizza dough and the breadstick dough. They're basically the same. And then this is the waffle dough. Now if you take a look at the pizza dough, it does have some air pockets to it, but that's just happenstance. There is no yeast in any of these doughs. If yeast were to be added prior to freeze drying, once the yeast is activated by using water, it will be destroyed in the vacuum process. Okay, this is the last of the doughs. So this right here, this is the waffle dough, although I should say it was waffle dough batter. So we have the biscuits, the pizza and breadsticks, and the last one is waffles. Now, when we reconstitute those, we're just going to put water in the waffles and the biscuits, but we'll have to put water and yeast back into the breadsticks and the pizza dough. This is our freeze-dried biscuit powder, and we're going to put most of that in. I'm going to hold some of it back, just in case you make the mistake of putting too much in the first place. Normally we'd just go ahead and bag that up. Now I also have freeze-dried green onions, and I got some freeze-dried cheese, but we're going to reconstitute the biscuit dough first, and then we'll have to add the cheese and add some water to reconstitute the cheese and the green onions. We'll just do a little bit at a time until it comes to the consistency of biscuit dough, which is pretty much there as it is. Now I'm just going to add a couple of fistfuls of cheese. That's probably enough, a little bit more maybe. And we're going to put some green onions in there. You can sure smell the green onions. And I'm going to let this sit here just for a while so the cheese and the green onions and everything else can absorb the moisture. Okay, we're just about there. We're going to go ahead and add the rest of this. And just a little bit more water. You have to kind of gauge by how sticky it is, and biscuit dough should be kind of sticky, especially the Bisquick. It should not be a runny dough at all. A bit of a spray. There we go. And it's going to go into a 400-degree oven, and 400 degrees for 13 to 16 minutes until golden brown. Okay, just have to wait for the oven to heat up. Okay, our biscuits are done. So let's take a look at one of these guys here. Wow, that looks really, really good. And the taste, that's good. You can see the cheese and the onions in there. So this is a really good, and biscuits are usually a little bit on the crumbly side. Well, that is really good. Oh, and one other thing. These biscuits are gluten-free. I use the gluten-free Bisquick recipe for these. So both my wife and I can enjoy these tonight. Next up are waffles. And this is going to be pretty simple. Just add water until you get the consistency of waffle batter. Can't be much more easier than that. We're going to be having Belgian waffles for dinner tonight. We'll add a little water as you go. You want to make it too soupy, but you don't want to make it too thick either. You want to be able to have the waffles flow around the mold. Be thick enough to pour from a measuring cup. That's how I always do it. So let's try this out and see how it goes. Alright, let's see how this comes out. Well, I probably should have put a little bit more batter in. That's not too bad. Probably a little bit darker than I'd like, so I'll have to adjust this down a bit. Well, the ready light right here is on, but the ready light back here is not. What they look like. They're done. So I'm not sure why that other light is not coming on. Okay, so we're just going to take a piece of this and give it a sample taste. Tastes like a waffle, but we're not done yet. Now, like a waffle. It's good. This is our freeze-dried bread dough, so this is what it looks like when it came out of the freeze dryer, and this is what it looks like after I sent it through the food processor. It really needs to be in a powdered form to reconstitute it, because soaking this in water just is not a practical way of doing things. So this dough does not have yeast, so we're going to add store-bought commercial yeast to this side, and we're going to put the homemade yeast on this side, and we're going to knead the bread, let it rise and bake it, and we're going to see how well the homemade yeast compares to the store-bought yeast. I have the commercial yeast in this container, and this is my homemade yeast, and the instructions say it's like 2 to 1, but one of the things they tell you is to smell it and see how strong the yeast is. So the proportions are not going to be quite accurate, so I'm just going to have to guess on how much of the homemade yeast to use. And I think I'd rather trial on putting more of it in there than not. And if it overrises, then I can adjust it later on. Make potato water yeast. We're going to start with 1/4 pound of potatoes, thinly sliced, just like if you're going to be making mashed potatoes. We'll go ahead and bring it to a boil and boil the potatoes until they become soft. In addition to the sliced potatoes, we're going to need 2 cups of potato water. So I would start with 2.5 cups boiling to yield 2 cups once we're done. Once we check that our potatoes are soft, we're going to turn off the heat, drain the water from the potatoes. Here's some of the supplies you're going to need to make your own yeast. I'd go with a wide mouth 2-quart jar. You can need either paper towel or a coffee filter, 1 cup of flour, 2 tablespoons of sugar. Of course, something to strain your water with. So we're going to start with the water, our potato water. So this is well over 2 cups of water. You have a couple of choices. You can put this in the fridge, set it outside, but this needs to cool down to room temperature. If you use the scalding hot potato water, you're going to virtually sterilize your medium and potentially kill any possible yeast you're going to catch. So let this cool down. We're going to take the 2 cups of potato water and pour it into our jar. We're going to add 1 cup of flour, and the 2 tablespoons of sugar. And they're going to mix this up into a nice, smooth liquid. At this point, we need to capture the yeast. Now, there's a couple of different philosophies on how to do this. Yeast is everywhere. It's airborne. If you have a house with HEPA filters, a sealed tight house, there's a chance that there's going to be less yeast inside than outside. You're going to have to leave this open for a while, obviously, for the yeast to enter into the jar. But while you're doing that, you also don't want flies or gnats or other things entering into the jar too. So what I have found to be best is to do this at night and then place this outside where the bugs and the things are going to be basically dormant and not flying around. But it needs to be somewhat warm. You can't put this outside where it's going to freeze and freeze your medium. So you're going to have to find a place to do this. I've done it inside the house before. There's no problems. Right now it's January and it's going to freeze tonight, so I'm just going to leave this open in my house. I don't have any flies or anything. So This is going to be left open until tomorrow morning, so it's going to be left open for probably about 10 hours. And then tomorrow morning, I'm going to go ahead and take either the coffee filter or the paper towel and a canning ring, and I'm going ahead and put this on like that. This will allow the air in here to breathe, because as the yeast develop, as a colony becomes larger, they're going to be eating the starches and sugars and basically putting out carbon dioxide. And so that's why we're going to let this have the ability for it to breathe. We're going to place this in the refrigerator, and you want to monitor this for a couple of days or so. The liquid in here will start to get thick. If you're successful, you'll start seeing little air bubbles. Actually, they're not air bubbles, they'll be carbon dioxide bubbles forming down here in the solid part of the liquid, and you'll start seeing bubbles and foam being generated up on the top of the surface. Go ahead and leave this in your refrigerator for 2 to 3 days or so, and then you can start to use it. As you use it, it's going to be on about a 2 or 3 to 1 ratio with regular store-bought yeast. Sometimes it's better to use a little bit more than less. It depends on how strong your colony of yeast is going to be inside this jar. As you use your yeast, you're going to have to replenish the liquids inside. And if you don't use it, you'll need to give the yeast some food to eat to keep the colony alive. And it's recommended to use 3/4 cup water, 3/4 cup flour, a tablespoon of sugar, remove half the liquid, put the new material in, stir it up, and put it back in the fridge. And from time to time, you'll want to smell this and see if it smells like yeast. If it starts smelling funky or putrid, there's a possibility that your colony is probably dead and something happened to it, and you'll have to start over again. So this is the potato water. This is the potato water method to making yeast. I'm also working on this. I haven't used this concoction yet, but this is raisins in water, and it's supposed to smell a little bit like wine, but this has not smelled anything like wine, and you're supposed to stir this twice a day, but this does not look promising, and so I'm just going to have to see what happens with this. But there are several ways to making yeast, and also starters for sourdough bread. This is really not a sourdough bread starter, this is just yeast. And so try it out. I have had success in baking bread with this, and it does work. It's totally amazing, and it surprised myself. So good luck. And then with that, we're going to put a little bit of the flour in there so the yeast has something to chew on. And then we're going to add warm water. We're going to let this sit and see how it ferments. I'm going to need the store-bought yeast first, and I'll use. So this is store-bought. I'll do this one first, and then I'll do the homemade yeast later on. Now, this is quite a grainy ball because it was not fully powdered, and so I'm just going to leave this in a round ball. I'm going to wrap it with saran wrap to give the moisture an opportunity to penetrate all the flour granules. So the store-bought yeast is in this bundle right here. This is a homemade yeast. So we'll let this sit for a while to soak up all the moisture. So this dough is with the regular yeast, and I made it extra sticky to help the dough absorb the moisture. So it's still kind of on the sticky side, but that's okay. So we're going to go ahead and start kneading this. I'm going to add flour as I can to try to get this dough as smooth as possible. So rigorous kneading pretty much smoothed all those little particles in the dough, so the dough's nice and smooth. So I have my bread pan, and I'm going to flour this. And put that in there. We're going to cover it up and put it in a warm place to raise. Now this is the dough that has the commercial yeast. This is the dough that has the homemade yeast, and that's next. So you can still feel the little chunks in here, and this is still quite sticky, but after we knead it, that should smooth out. So after a whole lot of kneading, the dough that has the homemade yeast got smooth. All those little particles that didn't mix originally are now pretty well mixed in here. So it takes a good amount of kneading. I guess I could have used my KitchenAid to knead it, but I just thought I'd do it by hand. So this is the dough with the homemade yeast. So we're going to put this in a warm spot. Now, one of the things I read on the article about this, it takes a lot longer for homemade yeast to rise than the store-bought yeast, so we might have to see how this goes. I'm hopeful. Just as a side note, you know, when you have all that flour and stuff on your countertop, I found a way to clean up really easy is a canning ring. It's a softer metal. It generally won't hurt anything, but you can use this to scrape up all that flour and water garbage so you can wipe off your counter a lot easier. Just something that I found helpful in the past. This is the freeze-dried bread that had store-bought yeast in it. It rolls really, really well. So I'm very happy with this. This is called honey wheat bread. Nice and fluffy. Needs a lot of butter on it. I'm very happy with this. So you can make freeze-dried bread, but you just can't put the yeast in with it. You have to put the yeast in after the fact. So the other bread with the homemade yeast is still rising. It's taken a long time for that. I'm so hopeful. So on we go. All right. Good things come to those who wait. So this is our bread with our homemade yeast. It actually rose. It took 4 hours, but it actually worked. I'm excited. So into the oven it goes, and I can smell the yeast. So I'm getting very optimistic. Well, it finally came out. This is the bread that was made with homemade yeast. Still warm out of the oven. So how about that? Now, this is the bread that was made with store-bought yeast. So you can see that the store-bought yeast, this only took about a half hour to rise. This took 4 hours to rise. But this is the first time I ever made bread with homemade yeast. It was very interesting, and I'm going to have to study more about it. But how does it taste? The taste is a little bit different. It's more like a sourdough. It's kind of a cross between traditional bread and a sourdough. Now, I can imagine that happened because I guess this is how they make sourdough starter. But it's good. I started my yeast 3 days ago. So this is my homemade yeast. It's basically flour, water, and sugar. And I had to use about 3 times the amount of this yeast as to the store-bought yeast. But for my first attempt at homemade yeast, I think it went very well. So we have store-bought yeast and homemade yeast from freeze-dried dough. I think it went very well. I'm very proud how everything turned out. But this is something I'm definitely going to work on to see if I can make the yeast recipe from homemade yeast even better. So I'm going to have to keep this alive. The instructions say that I need to add additional flour and sugar and water every week and keep it stirred up. And I'm hoping by doing so, the yeast population, the colony, will increase, and I'm hoping that'll work better. This is the freeze-dried batter. I've already taken it out of the tray. So this batter freezes up very well and can be used for onion rings, or any number of Chinese food batters. So we're just going to mix up part of this just as a sample. And you can make this as thick or as thin as you want. So here's our onion rings, nice golden brown, and they're hot. The only thing I need now is some fry sauce. But this just gives you an idea of all the things you can do with the freeze dryer when it comes to dough, batter, and breads. So this is the last of our freeze-dried dough. This is the pizza and breadstick dough. This is the yeast, so we're going to just throw a little bit of dough in with the yeast so the yeast has something to chew on. And we're going to go ahead and activate the yeast here. And get the yeast up and kicking. So we're going to let this sit for a few minutes, and then we'll mix all the ingredients together. Okay, our yeast is all foamed up, so that's going in. So we just want to mix this up into a basic dough consistency, and then we're going to knead it, and then we'll go ahead and shape it. Like I mentioned in the past, the dough kind of feels a little bit grainy, but that's normal. And as we knead this, the dough will go from a grainy consistency to a smooth consistency. Once it's smooth, we can go ahead and shape it. Okay, so what I did, I kneaded this dough with some extra water, so this dough right here is really sticky right now, and it's meant to be that way. The extra moisture will help all the little particulates in here that haven't softened up or get reconstituted since they're still kind of in a dry state. So we're just going to wrap this up into some saran wrap, plastic wrap, and just let this sit on the side for a while and soften up. Okay, we're going to take half this dough for pizza and half the breadstick. So this is going to be our pizza dough right here. And I think most people know how to roll out pizza dough. And throw some cornmeal down there to keep it from sticking. And we're ready to sauce this sucker. Now this piece of dough is going to be for the breadsticks. And this is a really good breadstick recipe. So they're all cut into shape. We're gonna put them into rye. Before we do that, we got butter, we got garlic salt, and this is the secret. We have this McCormick's Perfect Pinch Salad Supreme. This stuff is great on breadsticks. And then we also have Parmesan cheese. So we're gonna get the butter. We're gonna butter these guys up. And we got the garlic salt, not too heavy. And we have the Salad Supreme stuff, which is what really makes these things taste wonderful. Then we're going to top these off with some Parmesan cheese. We're going to get some plastic wrap. And we're going to lightly spray this so it doesn't stick to our breadsticks. And we're going to go put it in a nice warm place for this to rise. Okay, we got our homemade pizza sauce. And most of this sauce comes right out of our garden. And we got the mozzarella cheese with a little bit of other cheeses mixed in here with it. And then we have the pepperoni. Okay, there we go. Pepperoni pizza. Going to throw it in the oven at 425 degrees for about 15 minutes or so. Here we go. Straight out of the oven. And very, very hot out of the oven. So here we go. Hot, fresh pizza. Very hot. Very hot pizza. This is good pizza. It's too hot to eat right now, but there you go. Freeze-dried pizza dough, but fresh pizza. The best of both worlds. Here's our breadsticks. They have risen well, and these go into the oven at 400 degrees for 12 minutes. Here comes the second course, breadsticks. Now these look absolutely gorgeous, and they're going to be hot right out of the oven here. Okay, so these breadsticks, oh, those are gorgeous, aren't they? These were made from freeze-dried dough and then reconstituted, and they're still really, really warm. I'm going to have to let these cool off. Oh, these are good. This is actually my sister's recipe. So this turned out really well. So what did we do? So we made bread with regular yeast, we made bread with homemade yeast, we made cheddar green onion biscuits, we made the pizza, we made the breadsticks. So we were very successful in making doughs and batters. Oh, and we made the batter for the onion rings. So there are a lot of things you can still do with dough and batter and bread with a freeze dryer. Just have to remember a couple of rules. Don't put the yeast in with it up front. You have to put the yeast in afterwards because the yeast will die in the freezing process, in the vacuum process. And don't knead the dough. Knead the dough after you add the water back in, after it's been freeze dried. So I wish you success. Go out and try this, and I'd love to hear your comments, and thank you for your time.